I suppose I should start by telling you who I was, before that winter changed everything. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I used to be the kind of person who believed only in what I could see, touch, and prove. I was a folklore professor at the University of Minnesota, specializing in Native American mythology. Ironic, isn't it? I spent years teaching about legends I considered nothing more than fascinating cultural artifacts, stories that revealed the human psyche but held no literal truth. The Wendigo was one of my favorite topics to lecture about. I'd stand before my students, explaining how the Ojibwe and other Algonquian peoples created this creature as a metaphor for cannibalistic hunger, for the corruption that comes from consuming human flesh during times of starvation. I'd describe it clinically: a gaunt giant with yellowed fangs, sunken eyes, and an insatiable appetite for human meat. Just a story, I'd say. A powerful one, but still just a story. My colleagues often joked about my skepticism. Even among academics, there were those who held a certain reverence for the old legends, who spoke of them with hushed voices and respectful tones. But not me. I was different. I was enlightened. I was foolish. The catalyst for everything that followed was a research grant I received in the fall of 2023. The university had approved funding for a winter-long study of isolated folklore traditions in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness. The plan was simple: spend 3 months in a remote cabin, interviewing local Ojibwe elders, recording their stories, and producing a comprehensive academic paper on the evolution of Wendigo mythology in modern times. I remember the excitement I felt as I prepared for the expedition. Finally, I thought, I'd have the chance to document these stories at their source, to show the academic world how these legends functioned as social control mechanisms and psychological outlets for communities facing harsh winter conditions. I packed my recording equipment, my notebooks, my laptop, enough supplies to last months. I was so proud of my scholarly mission. The cabin I'd rented was perfect for my purposes. It sat on the shore of a remote lake, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable once the heavy snows began. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the closest town was 40 miles of wilderness. It was exactly the kind of isolation I needed to focus on my work without distractions. I arrived on a crisp October morning when the leaves were turning but hadn't yet begun their final fall. The cabin was modest but well equipped: a wood-burning stove for heat, a generator for electricity, and enough storage space for all my research materials. The lake stretched out before the front porch, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to go on forever in every direction. Those first few weeks were productive beyond my wildest expectations. I managed to interview several elders from the nearby reservation, each of them sharing versions of the Wendigo legend that were rich with detail and cultural significance. Maria Kingbird, an 84-year-old storyteller, spoke of the creature with such vivid imagery that I found myself taking notes long into the night. Her stories were particularly fascinating because they included details I'd never encountered in any academic source. According to Maria, the Wendigo wasn't just a cannibalistic monster. It was a being of endless hunger, yes, but it was also described as impossibly tall, sometimes reaching heights of 15 feet or more. Its body was emaciated to the point of being skeletal, covered in yellowed, frost-bitten skin that hung loose over protruding bones. Most disturbing were the eyes she described, sunken so deep in the skull that they appeared as black holes, yet somehow still capable of seeing everything, especially human weaknesses and desperation. But what struck me most about Maria's telling was her insistence that the Wendigo wasn't simply a metaphor. When I pressed her on this point, asking if she truly believed such a creature existed, her expression grew solemn. "Professor," she said, "there are things in these woods that your books cannot explain. The old stories exist because the old truths never died. I dismissed her words as the superstition of an elderly woman steeped in traditional beliefs. I even made notes about how fascinating it was to encounter someone who still held literal faith in these mythological constructs. How patronizing I was. How utterly unprepared for what was coming. November arrived with an early snowstorm that blanketed the wilderness in 3 feet of pristine white. I was thrilled by this development because it meant I was truly cut off from the outside world, exactly as I'd planned. The dirt road became impassable, leaving me with only my satellite phone for emergency communication. I had enough supplies to last until spring, and I settled into a routine that felt both productive and deeply satisfying. My days began at dawn with coffee and journaling by the window overlooking the frozen lake. I'd spend the morning transcribing and analyzing the interviews I'd collected, looking for patterns and variations in the Wendigo narratives. Afternoons were devoted to reading, both academic sources and the collection of handwritten stories that Maria and other elders had shared with me. Evenings were for writing, organizing my thoughts into what I hoped would become a groundbreaking paper on the psychological and social functions of monster mythology in indigenous communities. The isolation was intoxicating. After years of university politics, committee meetings, and the constant noise of academic life, the silence of the wilderness felt like a gift. The only sounds were the wind in the pines, the occasional crack of ice on the lake, and the steady rhythm of my own typing. I felt more focused and creative than I had in years. It was during the second week of November that I first noticed something unusual. I was sitting at my desk, working on a particularly complex analysis of Wendigo transformation narratives, when I became aware of a sound outside. It wasn't the wind or the settling of the cabin or any of the normal noises I'd grown accustomed to. This was something different, a low, rhythmic tapping against the side of the building. I paused in my typing and listened more carefully. The tapping continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I waited, but it didn't return. When I went to investigate, I found nothing unusual. No fallen branches, no ice formations that might have been responsible for the sound. I made a note of the incident in my journal, more out of academic thoroughness than any real concern. The tapping returned the following night, and the night after that. Each time I'd rush outside to investigate, but I never found an explanation. The sound always came from a different side of the cabin, always lasted for exactly the same duration, and always stopped the moment I tried to locate its source. It became something of a mystery that amused more than worried me. I began to think of it as my wilderness companion, a quirky environmental phenomenon that added character to my solitary retreat. By the time December arrived, I'd grown so accustomed to the nightly tapping that I barely registered it anymore. I was deep into the writing phase of my research, producing page after page of analysis that I was certain would establish my reputation as a serious folklorist. The Wendigo, I wrote, represented the ultimate fear of losing one's humanity under extreme duress. It was a cautionary tale about the thin line between civilization and savagery, a way for communities to process their anxiety about survival in harsh environments. I was particularly proud of a section I'd written about the cannibalistic aspects of the legend. Rather than viewing these elements as literal descriptions of monstrous behavior, I argued they should be understood as symbolic representations of how people feared they might change if pushed beyond their moral limits. The Wendigo wasn't real, but the human capacity for moral degradation certainly was. The legend served as a psychological safety valve, allowing communities to acknowledge these fears without having to confront them directly. Looking back, I'm amazed by my arrogance. I was sitting in the middle of the Wendigo's traditional territory, surrounded by wilderness that had barely changed since the legends first emerged, writing about how enlightened I was to understand the metaphorical truth behind primitive superstitions. I might as well have been issuing a challenge. The first really strange incident occurred on December 15th, during a particularly brutal blizzard. I'd spent the day inside, keeping the fire burning high and working by lamplight as the wind howled around the cabin with frightening intensity. The storm was so severe that I began to worry about the generator, which was struggling to maintain power against the driving snow. As evening approached, I decided to venture outside to check on the generator and clear snow away from the air intake. I bundled up in my heaviest winter gear and stepped out into the storm. The wind was so strong that it nearly knocked me off my feet, and the snow was falling so thickly that I could barely see the generator shed 20 feet away from the cabin. That's when I saw the tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Each print was enormous, easily twice the length of my boot and far wider. But what made them truly unsettling was their shape. They looked almost human, but elongated and distorted, as if someone had stretched a normal foot to impossible proportions. The toes appeared to be longer than any human digit should be, and there were what looked like claw marks at the tips of each impression. The tracks led from the tree line to within a few feet of my cabin, then circled the building completely before disappearing back into the forest. I followed them as best I could in the storm, my flashlight beam cutting through the swirling snow to reveal a trail that defied explanation. Whatever had made these prints was massive, walked upright, and had approached my cabin with what appeared to be deliberate purpose. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps a large bear, disoriented by the storm, had wandered closer to human habitation than usual. The snow and wind could have distorted normal paw prints, making them appear larger and stranger than they actually were. But even as I formulated these rational explanations, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trying to convince myself of something I didn't really believe. That night, the tapping didn't come from outside the cabin, it came from underneath. I was lying in bed, listening to the storm continue its assault on the building, when I heard the familiar rhythm coming from directly below my mattress. But this time, it wasn't the gentle tapping I'd grown accustomed to. This was more forceful, more deliberate, as if something was striking the cabin's foundation with considerable strength. The sound continued for nearly an hour, moving from room to room beneath the floor. I followed it with growing unease, tracking the source of the tapping as it traveled through the cabin's crawl space. At one point, the sound stopped directly under the kitchen, and I heard what could only be described as scratching, long, deliberate scrapes against the wooden supports that held up the floor. When morning came and the storm finally passed, I immediately went outside to examine the foundation. What I found made my blood run cold. The skirting around the crawl space had been torn away in several places, the metal panels bent and twisted as if by incredible force. The ground beneath the cabin was churned up with more of those impossible tracks, and there were scratches in the wooden support beams that looked like they'd been made by claws the size of kitchen knives. I spent that entire day trying to rationalize what I'd discovered. I researched the largest predators in the Minnesota wilderness, convinced I'd find some explanation for the tracks and damage. Black bears, I learned, could grow quite large, and their claws were certainly capable of causing the scratches I'd found. But bears hibernated in winter, and the tracks I'd seen were definitely from a bipedal creature. I considered calling someone, the local sheriff maybe, or a wildlife expert, who could help me identify what I was dealing with. But I was embarrassed by my growing paranoia, and I was afraid of being seen as a city academic who'd been spooked by normal wilderness activity. Instead, I decided to set up a motion-activated camera near the tree line, hoping to capture evidence of whatever was visiting my cabin. The camera was a sophisticated piece of equipment I'd brought for documenting my interviews. It could record in complete darkness using infrared technology, and it was sensitive enough to trigger on the movement of animals as small as raccoons. I positioned it with a clear view of the area where the tracks emerged from the forest, confident that I'd soon have answers to explain the strange occurrences. For 3 nights, the camera recorded nothing more interesting than a few deer and a family of raccoons. I began to think that whatever had caused the disturbance was gone, perhaps frightened away by my presence or driven deeper into the wilderness by the harsh weather. I even started to feel foolish for being so unsettled by what was probably just an unusual but perfectly explainable wildlife encounter. On the 4th night, the camera captured something that changed everything. I discovered the footage the following morning while reviewing the previous night's recordings. Most of it was exactly what I'd expected. Long stretches of empty forest, occasionally interrupted by small animals moving through the frame. But at 2:17 in the morning, something appeared that made me question my own sanity. The figure that emerged from the tree line was massive, easily 8 feet tall, moving with a gait that was almost human, but somehow fundamentally wrong. It walked upright on 2 legs, but its proportions were all distorted. Arms that hung too long, a torso that seemed stretched and emaciated, and a head that was too small for its body, yet somehow grotesquely oversized at the same time. The infrared camera couldn't capture color, but it revealed details that were deeply disturbing. The creature's skin appeared to hang loose on its frame, giving it the appearance of something that had once been much larger and had somehow deflated. Its face, when it briefly turned toward the camera, showed sunken features and eyes that reflected the infrared light like black mirrors. But what terrified me most was its behavior. The creature didn't move like a wild animal exploring new territory. It moved with purpose, intelligence, and what could only be described as cunning. It approached the cabin slowly, pausing frequently to look around, as if it was aware of being potentially observed. When it reached the building, it began to circle it methodically, testing doors and windows with its impossibly long fingers. The footage showed the creature spending nearly 20 minutes examining my cabin, probing for weaknesses, learning the layout. At one point, it stopped directly in front of my bedroom window and appeared to be listening, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it was trying to hear my breathing or heartbeat from inside. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the forest, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for something of its size. I watched the footage dozens of times, analyzing every frame, looking for some explanation that would allow me to dismiss what I was seeing. I considered the possibility that someone was playing an elaborate prank, perhaps using stilts or some kind of costume to create the illusion of a monster. But the movement was too fluid, too natural, and the proportions were too consistent to be the result of any kind of artificial enhancement. The academic in me wanted to approach this discovery with scholarly rigor. I had documented evidence of something unprecedented, something that could revolutionize our understanding of cryptozoology and folklore, but the human in me was terrified by the implications of what I'd captured on camera. I was no longer dealing with legends and stories. I was sharing my isolated wilderness retreat with something that should not exist. That afternoon, I made the decision to call Maria Kingbird. I needed to speak with someone who understood the old stories, someone who might be able to help me make sense of what I was experiencing. The satellite phone connection was poor, crackling with static, but her voice came through clearly enough. "Maria," I said, "I need to ask you about the Wendigo stories you shared with me. I need to know if you've ever heard of anyone actually encountering one." There was a long pause before she responded. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with concern. "Professor Mitchell, where are you calling from?" "I'm still at the cabin, conducting my research." Another pause. "You shouldn't be alone out there, especially not in winter. The old stories exist for a reason." "Maria, I've seen something. I have it on camera, something that matches the descriptions you gave me." "Don't say that name over the phone," she said sharply. "Names have power, especially when spoken in its territory. Where exactly is this cabin?" I gave her the location, describing the lake and the surrounding wilderness. As I spoke, I could hear her breathing change, becoming more rapid and shallow. "Professor," she said when I finished, "that area has a history. Many of the old stories come from those very woods. You need to leave. Tonight." "I can't leave," I protested. "The roads are impassable, and there's another storm coming. Besides, this could be the discovery of a lifetime, if this creature actually exists." "It does exist," Maria interrupted. "And it knows you're there. It's been watching you, learning about you. That's what it does. It studies its prey before it acts." "Prey?" The word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the winter air. "The Wendigo isn't just a hungry creature, Professor. It's intelligent, cunning, and patient. It doesn't just kill for food. It corrupts. It takes people who are isolated, vulnerable, and it slowly breaks down their sanity until they become something else entirely." I wanted to argue with her, to maintain my scientific skepticism, but the certainty in her voice was unsettling. "What should I do?" "Get out," she said. "Whatever it takes, find a way to leave those woods. And whatever you do, don't let it into your space. Don't open doors or windows, no matter what you hear. Don't respond to any sounds that might be human voices. The Wendigo is a master of deception." The line went dead before I could ask any more questions. That evening, I took every precaution I could think of. I checked and double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows. I built up the fire in the wood stove until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm. I positioned my remaining cameras to monitor all approaches to the building, and I kept my satellite phone within arm's reach at all times. As darkness fell, I tried to focus on my work, but concentration was impossible. Every small sound made me jump. Every creak of the settling building sent my heart racing. I found myself constantly checking the camera feeds, looking for any sign of the creature's return. At exactly midnight, the tapping returned, but this time it wasn't coming from outside or underneath the cabin. It was coming from inside the walls themselves. The sound started in the kitchen and moved slowly through the building, following the path of the electrical wiring and plumbing. It was as if something was crawling through the spaces between the walls, tapping against the interior surfaces as it explored the cabin's hidden passages. I followed the sound with growing terror, pressing my ear to various walls as the tapping traveled from room to room. At one point, it stopped directly behind my bedroom wall, and I could swear I heard breathing, slow, deliberate respirations that seemed to come from something much larger than human lungs could accommodate. Then I heard my name. It was barely a whisper, so quiet I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But as I stood frozen in the center of my bedroom, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart, it came again. "Thomas." The voice was wrong in ways I still struggled to describe. It sounded almost human, but there was something fundamentally alien about the pronunciation, as if whatever was speaking was having to remember how to form human words. The voice had a wet, rasping quality that made my skin crawl. Thomas Mitchell. Now it was coming from the living room, and I realized with growing horror that the creature had somehow gotten inside the cabin. I grabbed my largest kitchen knife and crept toward the main room, trying to control my breathing as I prepared to face whatever was waiting for me. The living room was empty. I searched every corner, every possible hiding place, but found nothing. The doors were still locked, the windows secure, and there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the cabin. Yet I was certain I'd heard something inside the building, calling my name with that terrible wrong voice. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. Several more times I heard my name being called, always from a different location, always in that same wet, rasping voice that seemed to come from something that was learning to mimic human speech, but hadn't quite mastered the technique. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted and on the verge of complete panic. I knew I had to find a way to leave the wilderness, but the prospect of venturing out into the forest with that creature somewhere nearby was almost as terrifying as staying trapped in the cabin. I decided to try reaching the main road on foot. It was a 15-mile hike through difficult terrain, but if I could make it to the highway, I could flag down help and get back to civilization. I packed a backpack with emergency supplies, including flares, extra batteries for my flashlight, and the satellite phone for emergency communication. The journey began well enough. The morning was clear and cold, with enough sunlight filtering through the pine canopy to keep my spirits up. I followed the buried dirt road, using GPS coordinates and trail markers to stay on course. For the first few hours, I actually began to feel optimistic about my chances of reaching safety. It was around noon when I realized I was being followed. I'd stopped to rest and check my progress when I noticed them, fresh tracks in the snow, following the exact path I'd taken. The prints were the same enormous, distorted footprints I'd seen around the cabin, but now they were trailing me with obvious intent. I increased my pace, no longer pausing to rest despite the growing fatigue in my legs. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop and look back, scanning the forest for any sign of pursuit. I never saw the creature directly, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As afternoon turned toward evening, I began to hear sounds from the forest around me. At first, they seemed like normal woodland noises, branches breaking, leaves rustling, the distant call of winter birds. But gradually, I realized these sounds were following a pattern, moving parallel to my route, as if something large was pacing me through the trees. The worst part was when the sounds began to mimic my own movements. When I stepped on a fallen branch, causing it to snap loudly, I'd hear an identical sound from somewhere off to my left or right. When I stumbled and my pack rattled, the same rattling noise would echo from the forest. It was as if the creature was learning to replicate human sounds, practicing the noises I made as I struggled through the wilderness. As darkness began to fall, I realized I wasn't going to make it to the road before nightfall. I was still at least 5 miles from the highway, and traveling through the forest in complete darkness would be suicidal. I needed to find shelter and wait for morning. I remembered seeing an old hunting blind earlier in the day, a small wooden structure built into a cluster of large pine trees. It wasn't much, but it would provide some protection from the elements and give me a defensible position if the creature decided to approach during the night. Finding the blind in the gathering darkness was challenging, but I eventually located it about a quarter-mile off the main trail. It was a simple structure, just 4 walls and a roof with small windows for observing game. The door was secured with a simple latch, and while it wouldn't stop a determined human intruder, it was better than nothing. I settled in for what I knew would be a terrifying night. I had enough food and water for several hours, and my flashlight was fully charged. I kept the satellite phone ready for emergency calls. Though I wasn't sure anyone could reach me before morning, even if I managed to get through. The creature arrived just after full darkness fell. I first became aware of its presence when the normal sounds of the forest suddenly stopped. The wind continued to blow through the trees, but all the small noises of wildlife, the scurrying of squirrels, the distant hooting of owls, even the rustle of mice in the underbrush, ceased completely. It was as if every living thing in the area had suddenly gone into hiding. Then I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling the hunting blind at a distance. The creature was taking its time, studying my hiding place, perhaps looking for weaknesses or planning its approach. I pressed myself against the wall, furthest from the door, and tried to control my breathing as the footsteps continued their methodical patrol. After what felt like hours, the footsteps stopped directly outside the blind's door. I held my breath and waited, knife gripped in my trembling hand, as silence stretched between us. I could sense something massive just outside the thin wooden wall, could almost feel its presence like a weight pressing against my consciousness. Then it spoke. Thomas. The voice was clearer now, more practiced, as if the creature had been working to perfect its imitation of human speech. Thomas Mitchell. I know you're in there. I didn't respond, didn't even dare to breathe. I've been watching you for weeks, Thomas, learning about you. You write stories about me, don't you? You think you understand what I am. The voice moved around the blind as the creature circled the structure. Sometimes it spoke from directly in front of the door, sometimes from the side walls, sometimes from what sounded like directly above the roof. You called me a metaphor, Thomas, a symbol, a psychological construct created by primitive minds to explain their fears. The creature's laugh was like the sound of wind through dead leaves. But I'm standing here, aren't I? Speaking to you. Does that seem metaphorical? I realized with growing horror that the creature had somehow heard my lectures, or read my papers, or gained access to my research in some impossible way. It knew exactly what I'd written about the Wendigo legend, and it was mocking me with my own words. I particularly enjoyed your theory about cannibalistic hunger being a symbol for moral degradation, the voice continued. Such insight from someone who's never known real hunger, never faced the choice between survival and humanity. The creature began to scratch at the walls of the blind, its claws leaving deep gouges in the wood. But you're about to learn, Thomas. You're about to understand what your ancestors knew, what the old stories really mean. Winter is long here, Professor, and you're so far from help. So very far from anyone who might hear you scream. I couldn't take the psychological torment any longer. Against every instinct for survival, I shouted back. What do you want? The scratching stopped immediately. When the creature spoke again, its voice was right outside the door, so close I could hear the wet breathing behind the words. I want you to understand, it said. I want you to feel what it's like to be hunted by something that exists outside your neat academic categories. I want you to experience the terror that your ancestors felt when they created stories about me. But most of all, Thomas, I want you to be hungry, really, truly hungry. I want to watch you change bit by bit until you become something else entirely. Until you understand that the line between civilization and savagery is much thinner than you thought. The voice moved away from the door, and I heard footsteps retreating into the forest. But just as I was beginning to hope the creature was leaving, it called back one final time. I'll be waiting, Professor. When you get hungry enough, you'll come looking for me, and I'll be ready. The rest of the night passed in terrifying silence. I didn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. Every small sound made me jump. Every shift of wind through the trees made me grip my knife tighter. I kept expecting the creature to return, to break down the door, to end the psychological torture with physical violence, but it didn't come back. As dawn approached, the normal sounds of the forest gradually returned. Birds began to sing, squirrels resumed their chattering, and life slowly crept back into the wilderness around my hiding place. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the hunting blind, I found the creature's tracks everywhere. The snow around the structure was churned up with dozens of the massive footprints, showing that it had indeed spent the night circling my refuge, watching, waiting, planning. But there was something else mixed in with the creature's tracks, the remnants of what looked like a recent kill. Scattered around the base of a large pine tree were bones, strips of hide, and patches of bloody snow. The remains were too degraded for me to identify the species, but whatever animal the creature had consumed, it had done so with savage efficiency. The bones were cracked and splintered, as if they'd been broken open to extract every bit of marrow. I stared at the grisly scene and realized this was a message. The creature was showing me what it was capable of, demonstrating the fate that awaited me if I continued to resist its psychological games. The hike back to the cabin was a nightmare of paranoia and exhaustion. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound, convinced that the creature was following me, but staying just out of sight. The 5-mile journey felt like 50, and by the time I reached my temporary home, I was on the verge of complete collapse. But the cabin was no longer a refuge. I now knew the creature could get inside whenever it chose, could manipulate the building's sounds and spaces in ways that defied explanation. Staying there was dangerous, but venturing back into the wilderness was potentially suicidal. I was trapped. Over the following days, the creature's harassment became more frequent and more psychologically sophisticated. It would call my name at all hours, sometimes from outside the cabin, sometimes from within the walls themselves. It began to mimic voices I knew, my mother, my ex-wife, colleagues from the university. The imitations were perfect, so accurate that I found myself responding before I remembered where I was and what was happening to me. The worst incident occurred on December 22nd, when I was awakened in the middle of the night by my ex-wife Sarah calling for help. Her voice was coming from outside the front door, and she sounded terrified, desperate, as if she was being pursued by something dangerous. "Tom! Tom, please help me! It's Sarah! Something's chasing me! Please open the door!" I was halfway to the door before rational thought kicked in. Sarah lived in Minneapolis, hundreds of miles away. There was no way she could be in the middle of the wilderness, and even if she were, how would she have found my isolated cabin? But the voice was so perfect, so filled with genuine terror, that part of me wondered if the creature had somehow brought her here, if it was using her as bait to lure me outside. "Tom, please, I'm hurt. I need help." I pressed my face to the window beside the door and peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then a figure stepped into the pale light reflected off the snow, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Sarah, or something that looked exactly like her. Same height, same build, same long brown hair. She was wearing clothes I remembered from our marriage, and her face was a perfect replica of the woman I'd once loved. But her eyes were wrong. Even in the dim light, I could see that her eyes were completely black, lacking any trace of the whites or irises that should have been there. And when she opened her mouth to call my name again, I saw rows of yellowed, pointed teeth that belonged to no human being. "Tom, what's wrong? It's me, it's Sarah. Please let me in. I'm so cold." I stumbled backward from the window, my hands shaking as I double-checked the locks on the door. The creature's ability to mimic human appearance was far more sophisticated than I'd imagined. If I hadn't noticed the eyes and teeth, I might have actually opened the door. The false Sarah continued to plead for several more minutes, before finally giving up and melting back into the forest. But the psychological impact of seeing my ex-wife's face twisted into something monstrous stayed with me for days afterward. I began to understand what the creature meant when it talked about psychological corruption. It wasn't just hunting me physically. It was systematically destroying my ability to trust my own perceptions. Every sound, every voice, every glimpse of movement became suspect. I was starting to question everything I saw and heard, wondering if the creature was manipulating my senses in ways I couldn't detect. The isolation was making everything worse. I hadn't spoken to another human being in weeks, had no way to verify my experiences or get an outside perspective on what was happening to me. I was completely alone with a creature that seemed to understand human psychology better than most humans did. It was during this period of maximum psychological pressure that I made a discovery that changed my understanding of what I was dealing with. I was going through Maria Kingbird's written stories, looking for any detail that might help me understand the creature's behavior, when I came across a passage I'd previously overlooked. It was buried in a longer narrative about winter survival, but it contained information that seemed specifically relevant to my situation. According to the story, the Wendigo didn't just hunt randomly. It specifically targeted individuals who were isolated, who had cut themselves off from their communities and support networks. It was drawn to people who were experiencing profound loneliness, who had lost their connection to other human beings. But more importantly, the creature fed on more than just human flesh. It consumed human sanity, human hope, human connection to the civilized world. The physical cannibalism was just the final stage of a longer process that began with psychological isolation and gradually progressed to complete mental breakdown. The story described the Wendigo's hunting method as a slow corruption, a gradual erosion of the victim's humanity that could take weeks or even months to complete. The creature would isolate its prey, then systematically destroy their ability to think clearly, to distinguish between reality and hallucination, to maintain their grip on their own identity. Reading this passage, I realized that everything the creature had done to me fit this pattern perfectly. The initial surveillance, the psychological harassment, the mimicry of familiar voices and faces. It was all part of a deliberate strategy designed to break down my mental defenses and prepare me for whatever final fate the creature had planned. But understanding the creature's methods also gave me hope. If this was a psychological war, then perhaps I could fight back on the same level. Maybe there was a way to resist the corruption, to maintain my sanity long enough to find a way to escape or get help. I decided to approach my situation like the academic problem it essentially was. I began keeping detailed records of every incident, documenting the creature's behavior patterns and looking for weaknesses in its approach. I noted the times when it was most active, the methods it used to enter the cabin, the progression of its psychological tactics. What I discovered was encouraging. Despite its supernatural abilities, the creature seemed to follow certain rules, certain limitations on its behavior. It was most active during the darkest hours of the night, between midnight and 4 in the morning. It showed a clear preference for psychological manipulation over direct physical assault. And most importantly, it seemed unable to enter the cabin without some kind of invitation or permission from me. This last observation proved to be crucial. Looking back over my notes, I realized that every time the creature had gained access to the interior of the cabin, I had inadvertently provided an opening. The night I heard it calling my name from inside the walls, I'd been checking the exterior doors and windows, unconsciously creating an opportunity for entry. The creature's presence inside the building always coincided with some action on my part that could be interpreted as an invitation. Armed with this knowledge, I began to develop a defensive strategy. I established strict protocols for interacting with anything outside the cabin. I would not open doors or windows for any reason after dark. I would not respond to voices calling my name, no matter how familiar they sounded. I would not investigate sounds coming from outside the building. Most importantly, I would maintain absolute clarity about the difference between what was real and what might be a hallucination or manipulation by the creature. I began talking to myself, verbalizing my thoughts and observations as a way of maintaining my grip on reality. "My name is Thomas Mitchell," I would say aloud. "I am a folklore professor at the University of Minnesota. I'm alone in a cabin in the Boundary Waters wilderness. I am being stalked by something that calls itself the Wendigo. It is trying to make me lose my sanity, but I am still in control of my own mind." These verbal affirmations became a lifeline, a way of anchoring myself to objective reality when the creature's manipulations became particularly intense. For several days, my new defensive protocols seemed to be working. The creature continued its harassment, but I was better able to resist its psychological pressure. I stopped responding to the voices outside my door, stopped investigating sounds that seemed designed to lure me into vulnerable positions. But on Christmas Eve, the creature escalated its efforts in a way that nearly broke me completely. I was awakened in the early morning hours by what sounded like a child crying outside the cabin. The voice was that of a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sobbing with the kind of heartbroken desperation that no parent could ignore. "Please help me," the child's voice called. "I'm lost and I'm so cold. My mommy and daddy can't find me. Please, someone help me." Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to open the door, to help this lost child who was clearly in mortal danger. The crying continued for nearly an hour, sometimes moving around the cabin, sometimes fading as if the child was wandering away into the deadly wilderness. I pressed my hands over my ears and repeated my affirmations, reminding myself that this was just another manipulation, that there was no lost child outside my door. But the voice was so convincing, so filled with genuine terror and desperation, that I found myself crying along with it. "I don't want to die," the child's voice wailed. "I just want to go home. Please, please help me." When morning came and the voice finally stopped, I was emotionally shattered. Even knowing that it was a trick, even understanding the creature's methods, I felt guilty for not responding to what sounded like a child in mortal peril. The psychological manipulation was so sophisticated that it continued to affect me even after I'd consciously recognized it as false. But I had held the line. I had not opened the door, had not provided the invitation the creature needed to enter my space, and gradually I began to realize that this itself might be significant. If the creature was so powerful, so capable of supernatural manipulation, why did it need my permission to enter the cabin? Why was it going to such elaborate lengths to trick me into opening doors and windows? The answer, I began to suspect, was that it wasn't as powerful as it wanted me to believe. Perhaps the Wendigo was bound by certain rules, certain limitations that prevented it from simply taking what it wanted through brute force. Perhaps its reliance on psychological manipulation wasn't just a preference, but a necessity imposed by whatever supernatural laws governed its existence. This realization gave me the first real hope I'd felt since the harassment began. If the creature was limited by rules, then those rules might provide a path to survival. I began to research everything I could find about supernatural entities and the limitations that folklore traditionally placed on their behavior. Most of my academic sources focused on the cultural significance of these limitations rather than their literal application, but I found some interesting patterns. Many supernatural creatures in world folklore were depicted as being unable to enter human dwellings without permission. Vampires couldn't cross thresholds uninvited. Fairies were blocked by iron and salt. Even demons were often portrayed as requiring some form of consent or invitation before they could fully manifest in the human world. I began to think of my cabin as a kind of sanctuary, a space that the Wendigo could influence but not directly violate, as long as I maintained proper spiritual and psychological boundaries. This meant not just keeping doors and windows locked, but maintaining my own mental clarity and refusing to give in to fear or despair. The creature seemed to sense my growing confidence, and its harassment became more desperate, more frantic. The voices outside grew more disturbing, the attempts at impersonation more sophisticated. It began to reproduce sounds from my past. My mother singing lullabies from my childhood, my father calling me in for dinner, old friends laughing at jokes I'd heard decades earlier. But I held firm to my protocols, maintained my verbal affirmations, and refused to engage with anything that came from outside the cabin after dark. New Year's Eve brought the creature's most desperate gambit yet. I was awoken just before midnight by the sound of my own voice calling from outside the cabin. Not an imitation or approximation, but what sounded like a perfect recording of my own speech patterns. my own accent, even my own vocabulary and manner of speaking. "Hey, Tom," my own voice called from the darkness. "I know this is going to sound weird, but I'm outside, and I really need you to open the door. I can't explain what's happening, but I think I'm in some kind of temporal loop or parallel dimension or something. There are two of us now, and the one inside isn't really you. Please, you have to let me in before it's too late." The psychological impact of hearing my own voice pleading for help was devastating. The creature had somehow captured not just my speech patterns, but my personality, my way of thinking, even the kinds of explanations I would naturally reach for when faced with something inexplicable. "I know you're probably thinking this is the Wendigo trying to trick you," my voice continued, "and I don't blame you for being suspicious. But look at it logically. If this was a trick, wouldn't the creature choose a more convincing approach? Why would it pretend to be you when it knows you wouldn't trust that?" The reasoning was exactly the kind I would use, the same academic approach to problem solving that had characterized my entire career. For a moment, I actually wondered if there might be some truth to what I was hearing, if something even stranger than a Wendigo encounter might be happening to me. But then I noticed something that broke the illusion. My voice outside was speaking continuously, without pausing for breath. No human being could maintain such a long monologue without taking in air, but the voice never stopped, never showed any sign of respiratory rhythm. This small detail reminded me that I was dealing with something inhuman, something that could mimic human speech and thought patterns, but couldn't perfectly replicate human physiology. The creature's impersonation skills were remarkable, but they weren't flawless. I remained silent and waited for the voice to give up. It continued pleading for nearly 2 hours, using increasingly sophisticated arguments and emotional appeals, but I didn't respond. Finally, just as the new year officially arrived, the voice stopped and the creature retreated back into the forest. January brought a new phase in my ordeal. The creature seemed to have exhausted its repertoire of psychological tricks, and its behavior became more unpredictable, more desperate. Instead of the methodical harassment I'd grown accustomed to, it began to engage in seemingly random acts of supernatural vandalism. I would wake to find objects in the cabin moved or rearranged. My research notes would be scattered across the floor, organized in patterns I couldn't decipher. The fire in the wood stove would be extinguished, leaving the cabin cold and dark. Food would vanish from my supplies, or sometimes spoil overnight, despite the freezing temperatures. Most disturbing was what happened to my technology. The satellite phone would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, its screen glowing with gibberish text or impossible coordinates. My laptop would open files I'd never created, documents filled with what looked like my own handwriting, but containing words I'd never written. One morning, I found that every book I'd brought for my research had been altered. Pages were torn out, paragraphs were crossed out with what looked like claw marks, and new text had been added in the margins. The new writing was in my own handwriting, but I had no memory of creating it. The added text was disturbing in its content and implications. It contained detailed descriptions of cannibalistic rituals, recipes for preparing human flesh, philosophical justifications for consuming other people during times of extreme hunger. All of it was written in my academic voice, as if I'd been researching these topics as scholarly subjects. Reading these passages was like looking into a funhouse mirror of my own mind, seeing my thoughts and writing style twisted into something monstrous. The creature was showing me how easily the line between civilization and savagery could be crossed, how quickly academic objectivity could become personal obsession. But perhaps the most unsettling part was that some of the writing actually made sense to me. After weeks of isolation and psychological pressure, after experiencing genuine hunger as my food supplies dwindled, I found myself nodding along with some of the justifications the creature had placed in my books. This was the moment I realized how close I was to the edge, how successful the creature's psychological campaign had been. I was starting to think like the thing I was supposed to be studying, starting to see the world through the lens of survival at any cost. I forced myself to burn the altered books, despite the fact that some of them were irreplaceable research materials. I couldn't risk continuing to read the creature's corrupted version of my own thoughts, couldn't allow it to continue poisoning my mind with its twisted philosophy. But by mid-January, I was facing a practical crisis that no amount of psychological resistance could solve. I was running out of food. The creature had been systematically destroying or contaminating my supplies for weeks, and I hadn't been able to replenish them because of my isolation. I estimated that I had perhaps a week's worth of rations left, maybe less, if I continued to lose food to the creature's nocturnal vandalism. For the first time since the ordeal began, I was facing the prospect of actual starvation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The creature associated with cannibalistic hunger was deliberately creating a situation where I might be forced to consider cannibalism myself. But I still had options. I could attempt another hike to the main road, better prepared this time, and with a clearer understanding of what I was facing. I could try to construct some kind of signal that might attract rescue aircraft. I could even attempt to hunt or trap local wildlife, though my experience with wilderness survival was limited. What I couldn't do was give in to the creature's psychological pressure, couldn't allow hunger to drive me to the kind of moral compromise it seemed to be encouraging. It was on January 18th that I made a discovery that changed everything yet again. I was conducting one of my regular checks of the cabin's perimeter, looking for new tracks or signs of the creature's presence, when I noticed something unusual about the forest itself. The trees nearest to the cabin showed signs of damage that I'd previously attributed to normal winter weather, but looking more carefully, I realized the damage followed a distinct pattern. Scratches on the bark, broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, all of it formed a rough circle around my temporary home, with the cabin at the exact center. The creature had been marking its territory, establishing a boundary that encompassed my refuge and the immediate surrounding area. But more importantly, I noticed that this boundary seemed to represent the limit of the creature's influence. Outside the marked area, the forest showed no signs of supernatural interference. The trees were healthier, the wildlife more active, and the general atmosphere less oppressive. I decided to test this theory by carefully approaching the boundary from inside the marked zone. As I got closer to the edge of the disturbed area, I felt a noticeable change in the psychological pressure that had been constant for weeks. The sense of being watched diminished. The feeling of malevolent presence faded, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. This discovery suggested that the creature's power wasn't unlimited, that it was somehow bound to this particular area of the forest. If I could somehow get beyond the boundary, I might be able to escape its influence entirely. But crossing the boundary wouldn't be simple. The creature had established the perimeter for a reason, and it would certainly try to prevent me from leaving its territory. I would need to plan my escape carefully, choosing the right moment and the best route to maximize my chances of success. I spent the next few days mapping the boundary as accurately as possible, looking for weak points or gaps in the creature's surveillance. The marked area was roughly circular, about half a mile in diameter, with the cabin positioned near the center. The boundary was most heavily marked on the side facing the main road, suggesting that the creature was particularly concerned about preventing escape in that direction. But there were other options. To the north, the boundary extended to the edge of the frozen lake, and the markings there were less dense, less emphatic. If I could cross the lake under cover of darkness, I might be able to reach the far shore before the creature could intercept me. The plan was risky, but it offered better odds than trying to fight through the heavily marked forest boundaries. The lake was perhaps a quarter-mile across, And while the ice was thick enough to support my weight, crossing it would leave me completely exposed and vulnerable. I decided to make my attempt on January 22nd, during the new moon when the darkness would provide maximum concealment. I spent the preceding days preparing, gathering warm clothing, plotting the most direct route across the ice, and identifying landmarks on the far shore that would help me navigate in the dark. I also took the time to write detailed accounts of everything I'd experienced, just in case something went wrong during the escape attempt. These notes would serve as both a record of my ordeal and a warning to anyone else who might encounter the creature in the future. The night of the escape arrived with perfect conditions: clear skies, no wind, and temperatures cold enough to ensure the lake ice was solid. I waited until well after midnight, when the creature typically began its patrol of the cabin's immediate vicinity, then slipped out through a window on the side facing the lake. The creature had grown accustomed to my complete passivity, to my refusal to leave the cabin after dark. I was hoping this complacency would work in my favor, giving me a head start before it realized what I was attempting. The walk from the cabin to the lake shore took only a few minutes, but every step felt like it might be my last. I expected at any moment to hear the creature's voice calling my name, to feel its massive presence materializing out of the darkness behind me, but I reached the edge of the ice without incident. The lake stretched before me like a field of polished black glass, its surface reflecting the stars with crystalline clarity. The far shore was barely visible as a dark line against the horizon, but I had my compass and my predetermined route memorized. I stepped out onto the ice and began the longest quarter-mile of my life. The crossing was eerily quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps on the frozen surface and the distant whisper of wind through the surrounding forest. I moved as quickly as I dared, knowing that speed was more important than stealth once I was committed to the open ice. I was perhaps halfway across when I heard the howl. It started low, almost below the threshold of human hearing, then rose to a pitch that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The sound came from the direction of the cabin, but it carried across the still air with supernatural clarity, reaching me despite the distance. The creature had discovered my absence. I broke into a run, abandoning caution for speed as I raced across the remaining stretch of ice toward the distant shore. Behind me, I could hear crashing sounds as something large moved through the forest at incredible velocity, heading straight for the lake. I reached the far shore just as the creature burst from the tree line behind me. I risked a glance back and saw it standing at the edge of the ice, a massive silhouette against the pale snow. It was larger than I'd ever imagined, easily 12 feet tall, with proportions that seemed to shift and change as I watched. For a moment, creature and man stared at each other across the frozen expanse of the lake. Then, to my amazement, it let out another howl, this one sounding almost like frustration, and turned away from the water's edge. It wasn't following me. I didn't stop to analyze why the creature had broken off its pursuit. I plunged into the forest on the far side of the lake and kept moving, guided by compass and desperation. The boundary I'd crossed wasn't just geographical. I could feel the psychological pressure lifting with every step I took away from the lake. By dawn, I was far enough from the creature's territory to risk using the satellite phone. The call to emergency services was brief but effective. A man lost in the wilderness, coordinates provided, immediate rescue required. The rescue helicopter found me 3 hours later, hypothermic and exhausted, but alive. The official story I told was simple. I'd become lost during a winter research expedition and had spent several days wandering in the wilderness before finding my way to safety. The authorities were satisfied with this explanation, and I saw no reason to complicate matters with accounts of supernatural encounters. But I couldn't leave my research behind. Against the advice of the rescue team, I insisted that they retrieve my notes and equipment from the cabin. The pilot was reluctant to make the extra flight, but I convinced him that the materials were irreplaceable academic resources. When the helicopter approached the cabin area, we found something that defied explanation. The building was completely intact, exactly as I'd left it. But the surrounding forest showed signs of massive disturbance. Trees were uprooted, snow was churned up over a wide area, and there were gouges in the earth that looked like they'd been made by enormous claws. But there were no tracks, no signs of the creature itself. It was as if the thing that had tormented me for months had simply vanished, leaving behind only evidence of its fury. I never returned to the boundary waters. My research notes became the foundation for a very different kind of academic paper than I'd originally planned, though I was careful to present my findings as cultural analysis rather than personal experience. The university was pleased with my work on Wendigo mythology, though they noted that my writing had taken on a much more serious, less dismissive tone than my earlier publications. Maria Kingbird passed away the following autumn, but not before I had the chance to visit her one final time. I thanked her for the warning she'd tried to give me, and I apologized for my earlier skepticism about the old stories. "Professor," she said, "some lessons can only be learned through experience. The important thing is that you learned, and that you survived to share the knowledge." I asked her if she thought the creature was still out there, still hunting in the wilderness of northern Minnesota. "It never left," she replied, "and it never will. That's its nature, its purpose. But now it knows that there are still people who understand what it is, people who can resist its corruption. That knowledge makes it more cautious, more careful about choosing its prey." I think about her words often, especially during the winter months when the cold reminds me of those terrible weeks in the wilderness. I've changed my academic focus since returning to civilization, concentrating now on the practical wisdom contained in traditional folklore rather than its purely cultural significance. I still teach about the Wendigo, but my approach is very different than it used to be. I present the legend as both metaphor and warning, as a story that contains important truths about human nature and the dangers of isolation. My students often comment that I seem to speak about these topics with unusual passion, as if I have some personal investment in ensuring they understand the deeper meanings. If only they knew. The physical scars of my ordeal have long since healed, but the psychological impact remains. I find it difficult to spend time alone, especially in natural settings. I maintain contact with friends and family in ways I never did before, understanding now how crucial human connection is to maintaining one's sanity and moral compass. Sometimes during particularly quiet winter nights, I think I can hear something calling my name from far away. It might just be the wind, or the settling of the old house where I now live, or the echoes of traumatic memory. But I never investigate these sounds, never go looking for their source. Some lessons, once learned, should never be forgotten. I keep Maria's stories on my desk as a reminder of what I experienced and what I survived. They serve as both academic resource and personal talisman, a connection to the wisdom of people who understood truths that I had to learn the hard way. The Wendigo is still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of northern Minnesota. It's waiting for the next isolated soul, the next person who thinks they can venture into its territory without understanding what they're facing. It's patient, cunning, and utterly relentless in its pursuit of human corruption. But it can be resisted, it can be escaped. And perhaps most importantly, it can be understood for what it truly is. Not just a monster from old stories, but a very real danger that preys on human weakness, isolation, and despair. I've shared my story now, added my voice to the chorus of warnings that stretches back generations. Whether anyone believes it or heeds it is beyond my control. But the telling itself feels important, feels necessary. Some truths are too dangerous to keep secret, even if sharing them means admitting how close I came to losing everything that makes me human.